Hi everyone, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here with a new PB&J card class. And in today's video, I am bringing you along with me to do some watercolor painting. And recently, I've received a lot of questions about my watercolor painting techniques, the products that I use, the supplies that I like. So what I wanted to do is to put into one video and try and answer some of those frequently asked questions and also take you along with me as I create some cards, which you're getting a peek at here. Now, just a disclaimer before we begin. The first is I'm not a professionally trained painter, so I am just sharing what works for me and some of my favorite things right now and answering your questions that you've had for me. So to begin, I am going to share with you paper. So when I am watercoloring, these are kind of the things that I think of with paper. So what I thought I would show you is how my mind thinks of paper, and maybe this will help you. So if you look here on the screen, I have a very porous surface here and a non-porous surface. So I'm putting on that paint tray. You can see it is non-porous and the paint bubbles and sits on top of it. And I have a paper towel and the paint immediately is absorbed into that surface. You can't blend it very much and move it around. And I kind of think of paper along this spectrum. It's how it helps me understand paper. It's a very simple version of thinking about this. So what I have right here is Bristol paper, smooth Bristol paper, and this is closer to that non-porous surface. It's very smooth. Your paint sits on top of it. You can easily keep moving it around, lifting it, just like I could over on that plastic palette. So that's sort of that where that falls in the spectrum of paper. Then I'm going to grab here some cold press paper. This is Canson 140-pound cold press paper, and this is some hot press paper. And so I'll show you the hot press paper here. This is a much smoother surface than the cold press, but it is, to me, a little bit more absorbent. It's more on that sort of paper towel range of things. Or on the spectrum, it would be closer to that paper towel. You see, I can still move the color around and blend it, but not quite as much as I could on that Bristol paper. So you can see there, once it dries, it's not moving around as much as it did on that Bristol paper, but you do have quite a bit of play with it. So it's more, in my mind, on that absorbent side of the spectrum, where we've got like a plastic palette to Bristol, hot press closer to the paper towel. There are other options in between, but this is just very simplified. This is Canson 140-pound watercolor paper. It is cold press paper. It does have some texture to it. And to me, this falls in the middle. So it still has some give where I can move and blend everything around, but it is more absorbent than the Bristol smooth paper. None of these are a right or a wrong choice. It's more about what you like when you are painting. So if you feel like your paint is running all over the place and not staying where you want it, you might want to move more on the sort of absorbent end of things. If you feel like, oh, I just can't blend this, it's soaking right into the paper, you may want to move more onto that non-porous or that Bristol side of the spectrum. So Bristol is very smooth. That's another consideration. Cold press has some texture to it. So if you're stamping, it is recommended for me to use a stamp positioning tool so you can do a couple impressions to get a good impression. Hot press is very smooth. So if you find you want it to be easier to stamp, you might want to do hot press. This is the paper I use most often. This is Canson 140-pound watercolor paper. Recently they had a different cover to it, so I find it with either one of these covers. It's very easy to find, and so that's another reason that I often choose this. It's very affordable, it's very easy to find, and so that's the one I use most often. And you can see I've used one up there, and I usually buy this size, tear out the sheets, and then I can trim them down into either 5x7 or standard 3 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch paper or cards. Next, let's talk about paints. There are lots of different paints, and I love trying new paints, but these are the two that I reach for most often. So the first is the Sakura Koi Field Sketchbox. You can see this is well loved, and I have had this for years, and it's very handy. It has lots of colors that I love. I add two colors in there that are Arteza tube watercolors just because I really like the lighter um, sort of pastel feel to these with this. So no, if you want to start and you get this little sketch box, you can grab two paints and add them in there as you go if you find there's something favorite color of yours that you want to add in and you're not finding it in there. My other favorite type of paint, it's not really a paint, but I use it that way, and that is Distress Ink Reinkers used as watercolors. And I just add them into like a cheap little plastic tray. I think I got this one at Walmart or Target. It just takes a couple of drops and you can paint with those. And I love the vibrancy of those, and I think they're just fun to blend. When I am selecting colors for my palette, I just pick colors I love. And that's one thing I like about using the Distress Ink Reinkers. I've stamped and inked a lot with the Distress ink, so I'm very familiar with the colors. And I'm just showing here, I often like to pick like a light and a dark of a color. So peeled paint is lighter and forest moss is darker. And I can even pull in like a weathered wood color with that. Here I've got broken china and peacock feathers, so kind of a light and a dark version of some turquoises and blues. For pinks, I'm using picked raspberry and barn door. Barn door can kind of add that darker color. And yellow spiced marmalade. And then for a neutral, I like gathered twigs a lot. So whatever I want to paint, I kind of grab a light and a dark of the colors I'm anticipating using, and I put those into my palette. And here I will share with you a little bit about my setup. So I just have a very simple setup as I'm painting. I do this whatever kind of watercolor medium I'm using, but I do think it makes a difference. So I always have a folded up paper towel, a cup of water, and the paper towel is so important, and a brush. And I'll show you a little bit more with this brush in just a moment. But the thing is, I want to keep the brush tip at a point and I don't want too much water. So I am constantly rinsing off with water, patting it dry, and kind of twirling the brush as I pat it dry, and that helps get that tip of the brush nice and pointy. So as I'm painting, that is happening a lot of the time off camera. And in this video, I'm going to try and show you on camera some of this process too when we actually start painting. I promise we will paint some cards. And then you can see that keeps that brush tip nice and pointed and not too wet, either dripping with too much water or too much paint. Now, the brush that I am loving right now, I've been using for years, is one of my favorites. It is the Silver Black Velvet Round, and this is a size number 8, and I find I can get a small enough tip with this brush, but it's also large enough to do large areas. See, it's almost worn out, but it's an 8 on there. Again, this is just a personal favorite. You may find you like to have something smaller or bigger, but I'm just sharing what works for me and what I like to use and kind of answering your questions. This is the typical blending process, or I would like to say my starting point when I've got my image stamped and I'm ready to start coloring it in, and I'm mostly looking at creating areas of dark and areas of light. So there's no image here, but I just wanted to show you. You can see I've pat off my brush. I'm picking up just a little bit of that reinker paint and I'm putting it down. And if I want this to be the darker area, I put it where I want it darker, rinse off my brush, you can see, and then I pat it dry, and then I can move up into that darker area and it blends down into a lighter area. So you can see now I have from dark to light. If that was a leaf, I could have a dark to light area. Do that again. See here, wherever I put it down first is the most concentrated. It's just ink directly to the paper, and then moving in with water and blending up. And the ink or the paint will flow where it's wet. So you can see that will flow down where I started with the water, but it will dilute it as it comes back down. And you can always go in and blend it some more if it started to kind of flow where you didn't want it to flow. You notice there I'm often going back up to that water, rinsing off and patting dry on the paper towel. Now lifting is a very helpful thing to know about. And this is just lifting color, or sort of like vacuuming up some color. So if I have painted something and it's just darker than I want it to be, or I want to have a highlight in there and I didn't leave one, I can paint it down. I'm drying off my brush quite a bit, so it's pretty dry, or what's often called a thirsty brush, and I can lift color with that. It's kind of vacuuming it up, lifting it with that drier, thirsty brush. And you'll notice how often I kind of wiped it on that paper towel to make sure it was dry, and then you can see how you can lift color that way. That's why watercolor is so forgiving. And then also layering. So often, this is one thing I love about watercolor, is that you can layer your colors. Another reason why when I mentioned I like to grab two, a light and a dark, or like a pink and a red, and put those in my palette, or be thinking about that as I'm painting. So I'm just drying this here. Usually I will want it to be dry if I'm going to layer in color. And I'm picking up a little different blue and I'm putting that right on top. And you can see you can change the look. It's going on in a sort of transparent way, so you're not losing the color underneath, but you can layer that in. If you do it while it's more wet, it's going to blend and mix with the color beneath a little bit more. But you can see what a different look you get with that. And I can lift a little bit, and then you can see those two colors together. Now I will show you doing some layering while it's still wet. So here that's still wet, rinsing off my brush, getting a little bit drier, and I can actually sort of mix this into a new color right here while they're both wet in that area. So you can see it's just sort of blending them right on top of each other. You could go back, and there you can see the difference between those two colors. Now we'll get on to some stamping. So often when I want to paint, which I love painting, I find it very relaxing, I like to go through and pre-stamp a lot of images so that when I want to paint, everything is just ready for me to sit down and paint. So I am stamping onto that Canson 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, so it has some texture to it. So I'm doing this in a MISTI stamp positioning tool, and I am stamping here with Memento Toffee Crunch. And this is an ink color I like to pick if I want a real sort of no line look without feeling like I have to strain my eyes. If there's any areas I want to be black, I just go in with a PITT Artist pen. This is waterproof, and I just outline those right after I have stamped. One thing, these are all penny black stamps, and I will say that if you are looking to start watercoloring, I highly recommend penny black stamps because the quality of the image, like of the artistry of the illustration, will really make a difference in the finished product. And that's one thing I love about penny black stamps. They're unique, they're timeless, you can use them over and over again, and they are illustrated by professionals, and it really does make a difference in your finished product. So I've done some stamping with the Toffee Crunch, and here I am using some Ranger Archival watering can, and that just is more of like a black outline, but not quite as harsh as a black if you don't want to do that sort of no line look. I've done some 5x7 cards and some 4¼ by 5½ inch standard size cards. Some where I stamped the main image front and center, and some where I've just used part of the image along the side of the card. So I've just done all that pre-stamping, and then I have this stack ready to go whenever I want to paint. And I will list and link all of the stamps I'm using down in that YouTube description box below. So let's go ahead and start painting. So I had several requests for me to show sort of some real-time painting and with it zoomed out so that you could see my palette, my paper towel, and my cup of water, so you could get a sense of what this is like in real time, the movement back and forth between palette, cup, paper towel, project. And so this is what I have for you. This is a long video, so I apologize if you are really bored. I don't do the real-time painting for the whole video, but just a chunk of time here at the beginning. So you can see I put down that darker green where I wanted it to be darker, went back with water to blend it out, and now I'm doing some of that layering. So I started with the peeled paint color, then I put some forest moss right on top, rinsed off my brush, came back with just a little bit of water on my brush to blend that out. And same thing there. Now this is just water on my brush and I'm just blending that. And that leaf is done. Of course, I like to play around a little bit, and I thought here I will layer in just a little touch of blue, just for a little variation. Kind of pull that through, brighten it up a little bit. But I also wanted to mention that when you're working with a really high quality stamp with high quality illustration, you don't have to do all of this shading and blending. If you just swipe on a little bit of green or a little bit of pink onto your flowers, it'll still look beautiful because the illustration, the artistry is there for you. So don't feel like because I'm sharing these, this is how I blend, this is how I mix colors, this is how I lift color. Please don't feel like you have to do that. I'm just answering questions that people have had for me and sharing what I like, but don't be intimidated. It is totally okay, and I still make cards where I don't do all of this. I just stamp it and color it like a kid. Just color it in, and it still turns out beautiful, and in fact, sometimes those are some of my favorite cards. Now I'm just noticing here, sometimes with my camera when I zoom out a little bit, the focus goes in and out, so I do apologize if that's happening. It won't continue throughout the video, but I just wanted to show you this aspect because you had asked for it. You can see there on that petal, wherever one petal overlapped onto another, that's where I want it to be darker. And so I put the color down there first, rinse off my brush, pat it dry, and go back and blend that into sort of like the open space. Dropping in a little bit of that darker color. When I say darker color, it could be that I'm adding the red in there, or I'm going in like this with that pink, but it's mostly ink on my brush. Less water, mostly ink will make it darker. If you have more water on your brush, then it's going to dilute that and make it a lighter color. So that's just a look there at sort of the real-time process. Here I'm going to speed things up and just following though that same process. You can see when I go to the cup, when I pat it dry, and when I go to the paper or the palette. So just trying to give you the whole image here. Now painting is certainly not the only way that you have to color these images in. They're beautiful if you don't like to paint or color, just stamped and embossed, like in gold or silvers. They're really fun if you like colored pencils or marker coloring, Copic markers. You can color them any way that you like. One reason I really like painting, for me, it's it is very relaxing. I also find sometimes my hand will get tired, like if I'm coloring a lot with colored pencils, like my hand will get fatigued, and painting is just so easy on that. It's just the lightness of the brush and it just flows so easily. That's one reason I often reach for paints. I also think it's very affordable. Like my reinkers I have for my ink pads, and you use the tiniest little dot, so you can reuse these over and over and over. I've never had to buy a new one. Same thing with that Sakura Koi Field sketch box of watercolors. I've had that for years and it's very affordable and it just keeps lasting and lasting. There's not really any upkeep that you have to do with it. So I'm sometimes a little bit of a lazy card maker, so that maybe is why I like those as so much. But here I've just zoomed in a little bit, so thank you for your patience if the camera was kind of going in and out of focus on there. And there you could see I lifted some color, I'm layering some color. Also, sometimes I will dry. So there I wanted to go in darker on this sort of inner part of this leaf, but if I would have put that paint there when it was still wet, wet paint goes where it's wet, so it would have bled into another part of the leaf. So I just used my heat tool to dry it. If I was more patient, I would just wait for it to dry, but so I'll zoom in here for you with a flower up close. There I put down that paint. I'm kind of jumping around petals so it has a little time to dry before I do the petal right next to it so they don't start all flowing into one another. But if it did, all you have to do is lift some color and go back once things had dried a little bit more, or use your heat tool in between. Putting down that pink where I want it darkest. This is just a clean, barely wet brush. Blended it out and then just dropped in that little bit of red where I want it to be the absolute darkest. Sometimes if you just leave a little touch of white on a petal, that adds a lot of life to it. Or along the edges of the petals, leaving some white, it just adds life to your image. Here's where everything is dry and I am layering some color in. So I've just picked up that yellow and I'm just dropping it in and letting it bleed out onto the other areas where I have painted. And I'm kind of scrubbing it in there a little bit and then I can just sort of blend that. This is another thing I just love about watercolor is you can play around with mixing and matching and blending colors together. Now for all of the cards that I'm showing you today, all of the 5x7 larger cards where I'm doing the no line watercolor, I did keep track of which colors of reinkers I used on each card. So down in the YouTube description box below, you will find a list of all the penny black stamps used, and those will be listed and linked in that description box below. I'll also list the other supplies that I'm using, and that will include the colors of reinkers used on each card. So I'll separate it out for each card. And that will help you kind of see some of my favorite combos. You will see that overall, I really don't use that many reinkers overall. I kind of have a set of maybe 12 favorites that I reach for most of the time. Now here on this bird, you'll kind of see like I was showing earlier, just on that scratch paper, mixing some blues, lifting some color. I'm going to add another blue in here just to mix right on top, and it's just a little bit darker. You'll see I'll put that where I want it darkest, pat off my brush and kind of blend it in. And that variation of using a couple of blues, again, is just something fun to do and it adds a little more interest to your painting. And I'll go ahead and dry that just to be sure it doesn't bleed or blend too much. Now I do find with the Distress ink reinkers used as watercolors, they pretty much go on and dry the same color, which is one thing I really love about them. Other watercolors, I do notice that they will usually dry lighter, so that's just something to keep in mind depending on what you are using. There are certainly other watercolor techniques and ways to paint that I am not showing you in this video. Again, like I said, I just wanted to share with you what works for me, what I like to do. I think it's pretty low stress painting. Again, like I said, if you don't want to blend the colors like I am, you could just paint one color on each thing and it really will turn out beautiful. Now, another little tip is I have this Pitt Artist pen and it's very fine tip. It's actually, I think, like a journaling pen, but it's waterproof. And for really tiny stems, I like to use this. For me, that's easier than controlling a teeny tiny paintbrush or a liner brush. This is just a little bit easier for me to control. So I just trace right over those. Now here is that same image. This is on a standard size card. And I stamped it using that watering can Ranger Archival ink, a waterproof ink. I like that just because I feel like it's not quite as stark as a dark black. So it just leaves like a fresh light look. And I'm doing like super easy painting. Same image, but I'm not painting shading each petal. I'm just putting down some blues. You can see right over the middle, over the top. I'm not even being super careful to stay in the lines. I'm leaving white on the tips of the petals. There, I'm lifting some color because I just wanted to show you it doesn't have to be as layered if you don't want it to be. And you can see there where that quality of that image, it really makes a difference no matter what technique you're doing or whatever your painting level is. Also, these are nice large stamps. And for me, when I'm painting something in, often the bigger it is and the more open the image, it's easier for me to paint. And so I gravitate towards these type of stamps for watercolor painting because of that. And even though they're large, it doesn't mean you can't use them on a standard size card. You still can. It just fills in more of the card. It's quite beautiful, like I'm doing here. Here I am just adding another blue on top just for some interest without having to do precise shading of each flower petal, but it just makes it look a little different and adds some interest to those flowers in a simpler way. And just thinking here, if you're looking for ideas for colors or where to put shading, I also recommend to keep your packaging handy. That can help as well. So now here is an image that is a little bit more tiny, like I was saying. So I did on this one go ahead and shade these petals, but I wanted to show you it can be done pretty quickly. So I'm going into the petals where they're closest, like heading under towards the middle of the flower, and I put down my Distress Reinker, that paint, where it's just the paint, and then I can go back with my brush with just the water on it and blend it out. And again, it's water and I've pat it dry on that paper towel. So there's not much water there either. And I try to leave a little bit of white on the very tip of those petals. That will help them not fade into each other. But you can see there, that's a really detailed stamp and image, but you can quickly shade it in, especially if you can work in sections and you don't want to wait too long to go back and blend it, so don't do too big of a section, but you don't have to do one tiny petal at a time. You could do a surrounding area. You can see here after those were dry, I'm just going in and doing the same thing like the next layer above. Don't worry about it needing to be perfect. I will show you another card I did with this same stamp where I didn't do any of this petals blending it. I did it kind of like that those blue flowers before. I just painted them right on top, and that was it. I just painted them yellow. That's all I did. And so I'll show you that at the very end of the video. So I hope this isn't getting too long. I hope you can make it through. So I wanted to show you it doesn't have to be as detailed if you don't want it to be. It just depends what you're in the mood for. And then once that's dry, I went in with some yellow. It was a little bit too dark, so there I'm just lifting a little bit. Also, if you don't want to have to worry so much about getting the shading to help you see the image, you can stamp it in that black or that Ranger Archival watering can, and that will guarantee no matter what, however you paint it, if you want to just paint it one solid color or focus more of just the center of the flower being darker and the edges of it being lighter, the darker ink will capture those details for you. Now on this one, I love this stamp. This one is so unique. It's kind of one of my favorite stamps that I've painted in a while because it's just so different. But I wanted to show you here too how you can sort of mix colors as you move up. So you kind of get almost an ombre effect with this darker color down here at the bottom, moving into a pink and a peach and up to a yellow. So you can see there I did mostly purple with just a little bit of pink. And now here I'm doing mostly pink, putting down that mostly paint. Rinsing off my brush. I also here tried to back up the camera so you could see the palette, the cup, the paper towel, and sort of watch that process as I go. So that one is mostly pink with just a little bit of that purple down below. This ended up being one of my favorite color combos also. So again, like I said, I'll have the exact colors I'm using listed by card down in that YouTube description box below. Now here I'm using like a lighter version, so more watered down, and adding some of that peachy color with it. So by mixing those two on that flower, then you get sort of that in between or that mid color as you move up. It kind of creates that ombre. Now I pre-stamped several different images, and for each one I stamped it a couple of times. But if you really wanted to practice or just for fun, you could take just one stamp and stamp that, say, 5 times and try 5 different cards with 5 different color combos. That's just another way that you can get the most out of your stamps. I tend to like to grab stamps that have a similar theme. So like these are all very sunshine, happy, springtime stamps. And so that's what I was grabbing before I did all of my stamping. So moving on to this image, I wanted to give you a little look here on the vase. I just put down one color. I try to leave some areas of white, but I really did a poor job of that. So I'm going to do some lifting here. So I'm going to put a little bit darker down here at the bottom, blend that in a little bit, and then I'm going to lift some color. Right here you can see I'm really kind of scrubbing and lifting with that thirsty or pretty much almost dry brush, and even kind of pushing it as I do so. And that's all that you have to do on that. So here is a look at everything once I was done painting. Kind of show you both versions. Here's that one where I said you could do it real detailed like the red on the left, or on the right I just painted one solid color for the flowers, and they're both beautiful. This one I actually turned it so it was trailing down on the card. There's those sunflowers. Left version with more blending and shading. The other side mostly just flat color, both beautiful. And this one, I just did one. So sometimes you run out of time and you spill on the other one. You don't do it. So now, if you've done all your painting, which sometimes I just want to sit and paint, I don't have a card in mind. This is sort of my go-to design for finishing the cards. I take some blue painter's tape. I make sure it is not right off the roll. So I pat it on my sweater. If you have like a blanket or an Afghan handy, you can do that. And I put it onto the card. Now, I'm sure that this is totally dry. I'm taking that Memento Toffee Crunch ink and an ink blending tool and a foam pad, starting off of the edge and working my way on in a circular motion. And I'm mostly going where there is no image. So I don't want to overlap onto my coloring because especially with reds, even when you think it's dry, sometimes it will want to blend on you. And then I just grabbed some of these from my stash, some sort of background-ish stamps. I'll list these all for you down in the description box below. While it's still masked, using that same Toffee Crunch ink, I will add just a touch of stamping to that background. It's tone on tone because it's on that same color we inked with, and then I just add my sentiment. These are some really great sentiment builder sets. You'll see them on all the cards where you can kind of mix and match your colors, pull in like I'm doing this one, the blue that I used on the Bluebird. And that's how I finish off those cards. So you can see here, this one was pretty busy, so I just did the sentiment. I didn't do any background stamping. But again, I could mix and match the colors with those sentiment builder sets. Here's another one. I did do some background stamping. I thought the music notes was really fun with the birds. This one I did a little bit of background stamping. That open pot is a great place to add a sentiment. This one was pretty busy, so I didn't do any background stamping, just added my sentiment. And this is the one you just saw me do where I added a little bit of background stamping. So here's a look at all of the finished cards. If you stay till the end, I'll show you those more simple cards also. I really hope you enjoyed this process. I hope it wasn't too boring for you or too long. I'd love to know what you thought, and if you have any favorite cards, I always like to know which one you ended up liking best. I think mine was that first one, the Hollyhock, with sort of the peach and purple colors in it. And this one too, this bird is also a favorite of mine. So leave me a comment down in the YouTube description box below. If you enjoy this type of content, please also be sure to subscribe and also hit that notification bell. Then you'll get an email notification whenever we upload a new video so you won't miss any future videos. Now here are those cards where I did more simple coloring. I did do some background inking using an ink blending tool and a foam pad. And I finished these off using our Edger Sentiment dies, a really great way to finish off your cards, and also those sentiment builder sets that coordinate with those Edger dies. I also embellished with a few die cut butterflies, and again, everything is listed and linked for you down in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy stamping and happy painting.